Here's the uncomfortable question underneath everything we just described. What if the emptiness isn't the problem, but a structurally necessary part of what comes before the solution? I went through a stretch of this myself a few years back that I still don't fully know how to describe to people who haven't felt it. Nothing had gone wrong. On paper, things were fine. But for almost 2 months, I remember feeling like I was going through the motions of my own life. Showing up, doing the things, saying the things. While some quieter part of me had already checked out of a version of my life I hadn't consciously decided to leave yet. I spent a lot of that time assuming I was depressed or burnt out or breaking down. What I didn't understand yet was that I was between 2 versions of myself, and the emptiness was simply what the space between them felt like from the inside. What made it harder to recognize at the time was how mundane it felt from the outside. There was no single dramatic moment I could point to and say, that's when it started. It arrived the way weather changes, gradually. Then suddenly you notice the whole sky is different, without being able to name the exact hour it shifted. I kept looking for an external cause, because an external cause would have made the feeling make sense. There wasn't one. The cause was internal, structural, and entirely invisible from the outside. I mention the weather comparison because it's more accurate than it might sound. Nobody demands an explanation for why a sky slowly turns from blue to gray. Everybody understands weather changes gradually, through a process too slow to catch in any single moment. Internal identity shifts work the same way, but almost nobody extends them the same patience. Because there's no visible sky to point to, just a feeling, arriving without credentials, that gets treated as suspect, simply for lacking an obvious cause. Here's the structural reason that space feels empty instead of neutral. An identity, the version of you that's been running your life up to this point, isn't just a set of beliefs. It's an entire operating system. Your habits, your relationships, your sense of what matters, your daily rhythm, all built around a specific story about who you are and where you're headed. When that story stops being true, even before you consciously know why, the operating system doesn't get replaced instantly. It gets suspended. The old structure has effectively ended, even if nothing external has changed yet, and the new one hasn't been built. What's left in between isn't a version of you, it's the absence of a version of you. And absence reads emotionally as emptiness, because there's genuinely nothing occupying that space yet. Think about how strange that actually is, once you sit with it. Most emotional states have an object. You're sad about something, anxious about something, angry at someone. This particular emptiness often doesn't have an object, and that's exactly why people misdiagnose it so consistently. They go looking for the thing they're upset about, can't find one, and conclude the absence of an obvious cause must mean the feeling itself is irrational, or worse, a sign of some deeper problem. It isn't irrational. It's just tracking something structural rather than something situational, and structural changes rarely announce themselves with a single identifiable trigger. This is not the same thing as nothing happening. It's the opposite. It's the most structurally active part of the entire process, precisely because it's the part where the old identity has actually finished dissolving, which is a real event, even though it produces a feeling of stillness rather than a feeling of motion. There's a reason it's so hard to trust that something is happening when the only evidence is absence. Human beings are generally wired to read visible motion as progress and stillness as stagnation. Useful heuristics in most situations, because most of the time, stillness really does mean nothing is changing. This is one of the rare situations where that heuristic actively misleads you, precisely because the change in question is happening at the level of structure rather than the level of activity. And structure doesn't produce the kind of visible motion your instincts are scanning for. This mismatch between what's actually happening and what your instincts are trained to look for is on its own enough to explain most of the anxiety people report during this stage. It's not usually the emptiness itself that's unbearable. It's the fear that the emptiness means something has gone permanently wrong, layered on top of an already uncomfortable feeling. Remove that fear, and the emptiness becomes something closer to boring than terrifying. Uncomfortable, yes, but no longer catastrophic. So why does almost nobody recognize this stage for what it is while they're inside it? Because it's been documented, named, and studied for well over a century, just never in the language most people would think to look for. A friend of mine spent 3 months after a divorce feeling almost nothing. Not devastated, not relieved, just strangely blank, disconnected from a life that used to feel entirely hers. She told me later that the blankness scared her more than the grief had, because at least grief made sense. The blankness felt like proof that something in her had gone missing. Then, almost without warning, in the 4th month, she woke up one day with a level of clarity about what she actually wanted from her next chapter that she said felt like waking up from years of sleepwalking. Nothing external triggered it. The blank months, she realized afterward, hadn't been the absence of progress. They'd been the process, running silently, with nothing yet built to show for it. What she described afterward stuck with me. She said the clarity didn't feel like it arrived from outside. It felt like something that had been quietly assembling itself the entire time, underneath the blankness, and simply needed the full 3 months to finish before it was ready to surface. Rushing it, she suspected, wouldn't have produced the clarity any faster. It would have just produced a decision made from the old half-dissolved version of herself, instead of the one that was actually forming. This pattern is old enough to have its own name in anthropology, more than a century before anyone applied it to personal reinvention. Anthropologist Arnold van Gennep, studying rites of passage across dozens of cultures in the early 1900s, identified a consistent 3-part structure in every major life transition a culture formally marked: birth, marriage, coming of age, death. First, a separation from the old status. Then a middle stage he called the liminal phase, from the Latin word for threshold. A person in this stage was, in the eyes of their own culture, neither their old identity nor their new one, neither child nor adult, neither single nor married, structurally invisible, occupying no clear category at all. Then, finally, incorporation into the new status. What's easy to miss, reading Van Gennep's work today, is how deliberately and formally cultures mark that middle stage, rather than trying to rush past it. Initiation rites in many of the cultures he studied physically separated the person in transition from ordinary community life for a defined period, sometimes days, sometimes much longer, precisely because the culture understood that the liminal person wasn't simply delayed on the way to their new status. They were doing something. The separation gave that something room to actually happen, instead of being interrupted by the demands of a role the person no longer fully occupied. What's striking is how consistently cultures across the world marked that middle stage with imagery of emptiness, darkness, and death, not because the transition itself was dying, but because the old identity genuinely was, and there was, quite literally, no name yet for what the person was becoming. Van Gennep's work was later expanded by anthropologist Victor Turner, who described liminality as a state of being betwixt and between, stripped of the markers that normally tell you and everyone around you who you are. Turner noted something specific worth naming here. People in the liminal stage across very different cultures often reported feelings that would today be described as depersonalization or emotional flatness, not because something was wrong with them, but because the entire social and psychological scaffolding that usually generates a sense of identity had been deliberately, if temporarily, removed. Turner also observed something that translates directly into your own situation. Liminal people, across these very different societies, were often granted unusual freedoms during this stage, exempted from ordinary social obligations, allowed to behave in ways that wouldn't be tolerated before or after. The logic was consistent. A person who is structurally nobody, yet can't be held fully to the standards of somebody. There's a version of that permission worth granting yourself right now. You don't owe your old identity's obligations the same intensity while you're in this stage. Some slack here isn't avoidance. It's what every culture that studied this stage already understood was appropriate. That anthropological pattern found its way into modern change psychology through a specific, deliberate bridge. Organizational consultant William Bridges, in his influential 1980 model of transition, distinguished between change, an external event like a divorce, a layoff, a move, and transition, the internal psychological process a person has to go through to actually integrate that change. Bridges mapped transition onto 3 stages that echo Van Gennep almost exactly. An ending where an old identity or role is let go of. A neutral zone, an in-between period. Bridges described explicitly as feeling empty, disorienting, and unproductive, even though it's doing essential internal work. And a new beginning, where a new identity finally takes hold. Bridges' specific contribution, useful for you right now, was naming why the neutral zone gets misread so badly. People expect transition to feel like progress, visible, measurable, directional. The neutral zone feels like the opposite of all three. It feels like standing still, or worse, like regressing, precisely at the moment the deepest reorganization is actually happening beneath conscious awareness. Bridges' research, developed through decades of consulting with individuals and organizations navigating major change, found that people who tried to skip or rush through the neutral zone, filling the emptiness immediately with a new job, a new relationship, any available distraction, tended to land in new situations that repeated the same underlying problems they thought they'd left behind, because the internal reorganization the emptiness was doing had never actually finished. There's a detail in Bridges' framework worth sitting with directly. He insisted the neutral zone wasn't simply something to endure until it passed. He described it as genuinely productive time, if used well. A period where a person could examine, often for the first time in years, what actually mattered to them without the old identity's assumptions filtering the answer. The discomfort wasn't incidental to that work. It was, in a sense, the work, the felt experience of old assumptions no longer holding, with nothing yet installed to replace them automatically. So here's the deeper question this evidence forces open. If this stage is this well documented, across cultures and across a century of study, why does almost nobody recognize it while they're living through it, instead of panicking and trying to escape it? Part of the answer is structural, not personal. Every culture Van Gennep studied had an entire community, and often a formal role dedicated to recognizing the liminal stage for what it was: an elder, a ritual, a set of shared expectations that told the person in transition explicitly, this is supposed to feel like this and it will end. Almost nobody navigating a personal transition today has access to that same external confirmation. Without it, the exact same well-documented stage gets misread almost by default, as something going wrong instead of something going as it always has. Let's make this concrete, because there is almost certainly a specific emptiness this video has already brought to mind. Here's how to tell the difference between this kind of emptiness and simple stagnation, because the two get confused constantly. Stagnation feels heavy and repetitive, the sense that you're stuck doing the same thing with the same person, in the same way, and nothing is moving at all, including internally. This kind of emptiness feels different, even though it's uncomfortable in a similar register. It feels like something has already quietly ended, even though you can't point to the moment it happened. Old things that used to matter to you, a goal, a relationship dynamic, a version of your ambition, have stopped generating the feeling they used to generate, and nothing new has arrived yet to replace that feeling. If stagnation is a wheel spinning in place, this is closer to a wheel that's already come off, with the new one not yet installed. There's a simple diagnostic question that tends to separate the two quickly. Has this feeling been constant for years, unchanging, or is it relatively new, weeks or months, not years? And does it feel different in quality from ordinary boredom or dissatisfaction? Stagnation tends to be long-running and familiar, almost comfortable in its misery because nothing about it is actually shifting. This kind of emptiness tends to be newer, stranger, and harder to settle into, precisely because something underneath it actually is shifting, even if the shift hasn't surfaced into anything visible yet. There's a third useful marker beyond timing and quality. Notice whether the emptiness seems to follow you into situations that used to reliably generate a strong reaction, positive or negative. Stagnation usually leaves your emotional responses intact. You're still capable of real anger, real excitement, real connection, just stuck in a repetitive loop. This kind of transitional emptiness tends to flatten those responses across the board, temporarily, because the identity that used to generate them is the exact thing currently offline. Now here's the mistake almost everyone makes once they notice this state, and it's the exact mistake Bridges documented across decades of consulting work. They try to fill the emptiness immediately. A new relationship entered too fast to avoid sitting with the blank space left by the old one. A new job taken for reasons that don't actually address what made the old one stop fitting. A new hobby, a new city, a new look. Anything that promises to make the hollow feeling stop right now, without waiting for the actual internal reorganization to finish on its own timeline. This is where most people flinch, because sitting in the emptiness feels like doing nothing, and doing nothing feels to most people like failure. It's worth naming that fear directly. What if I sit with this and it never resolves? What if the emptiness is permanent, not transitional? That fear is real, and it deserves an honest answer rather than blind reassurance. The honest answer is that the anthropological and psychological record on this stage is remarkably consistent. The neutral zone, left alone rather than prematurely filled, does resolve, not on a fixed schedule, and not painlessly, but reliably, into a new beginning that couldn't have formed while the old structure was still technically standing. That doesn't mean doing absolutely nothing. There's a meaningful difference between prematurely filling the emptiness with a decision meant to make the feeling stop, and simply continuing to live, going to work, maintaining the relationships worth keeping, taking care of your body, while consciously withholding the big, identity-defining decision until it actually feels ready to be made, rather than desperately needed. The first response smothers the process. The second lets it run its course underneath an otherwise functioning life. Try this literally, not as metaphor. Instead of asking, how do I make this feeling stop, try asking, what is actually finished, that I haven't let myself admit is finished yet? That question tends to surface the real ending underneath the vague emptiness, a version of your career you've quietly outgrown, a relationship pattern that stopped serving you long before you consciously noticed, an old ambition that used to define you and simply doesn't anymore. Naming the actual ending doesn't fill the void, but it usually turns a formless emptiness into a specific nameable transition, which is far easier to sit inside than a feeling you can't locate the source of. Write the answer down if you can. There's something about seeing the ending named on paper, rather than circling vaguely in your head, that makes it feel less like a threat and more like information. Information can be worked with. A formless dread cannot. If nothing surfaces immediately, don't force it. Sometimes the ending is still too close to name clearly, and the honest answer to what has finished is simply, I don't fully know yet, which is itself useful information, not a failure of the exercise. Come back to the question in a week. It tends to sharpen with a little distance. There's no prize for identifying the ending quickly. The only real mistake available here is deciding, out of impatience, that if the answer doesn't arrive immediately, the whole exercise must be wrong for you. It isn't. It just runs on its own timeline, the same way everything else about this stage does. But knowing this and living it are two different animals, because there's a deeper reason the emptiness is so hard to sit with, and it has less to do with the discomfort itself than with what the emptiness threatens to take away from your sense of who you are. That threat is real enough to deserve its own examination, not just a passing mention, which is exactly where this video is headed next. Here is the layer underneath the layer. The emptiness isn't just uncomfortable. It's threatening in a very specific way, because it strips away the thing most people use to answer the question, who am I, without ever consciously examining it. Their role, their job title, their relationship status, their daily structure, their sense of forward motion toward a defined goal. When the old identity ends and the new one hasn't formed, that entire answer goes offline at once, not gradually but almost completely, which is why the feeling is so much more disorienting than ordinary sadness or boredom. Ordinary sadness has an object. This kind of emptiness often doesn't, because the thing that's missing isn't a person or a possession. It's the scaffolding you use to know yourself by. Most people build that scaffolding so early and so gradually that they never once experience the moment it went up. It simply becomes the water they swim in, invisible until, for reasons entirely outside their control, it's suddenly gone, and the absence is the first time they've ever actually felt its shape. There's an odd kind of relief available on the other side of that recognition once the initial disorientation passes. If the scaffolding was invisible and largely inherited, built from other people's expectations, timelines, and definitions of success, then the neutral zone, uncomfortable as it is also the first real opportunity most people get to choose the next version deliberately, rather than simply continuing to build on assumptions they never actually examined. Ask yourself honestly, if someone asked you right now, who are you really underneath your job and your relationships and your daily routine, how much of an answer would actually be there? For most people, most of the time, the honest answer is uncomfortably thin, because most people have never needed to answer that question directly. The old identity did the answering for them. It's only in the neutral zone, once that identity has ended, that the thinness of the underlying answer becomes impossible to avoid. That thinness isn't a personal failing either. It's simply what happens when a role does most of your identity's work for years at a time. The role gets so good at answering the question that the underlying self never has to develop its own independent answer. The neutral zone is, in that sense, the first honest audit most people ever run on themselves. Here's what that exposure is actually doing, and it's not damage. It's construction, even though it doesn't feel like it from the inside. Every rite of passage Van Gennep documented had this same structure for a reason. Cultures understood, in a way modern life has largely forgotten, that you cannot build a new identity on top of an old one that hasn't finished dissolving. The old scaffolding has to come down first, completely, before anything new can be load-bearing. The emptiness is that demolition, mid-process before the new frame has gone up, which is exactly why it feels like nothing rather than like progress. Demolition and construction look identical from a distance. Only one of them is finished. Modern life removes almost all of the ritual containers that used to hold this stage. No formal seclusion, no community that recognizes what you're going through. No elder who's been through it before to tell you how long it usually takes. You're often navigating a documented, ancient, universal human process completely alone, without a single external marker telling you it's supposed to feel exactly like this. That isolation, more than the emptiness itself, is often what makes the modern version of this stage so much harder than the versions cultures use to formally support. This is the actual mechanism behind the phrase, right before a reality shift, everything suddenly feels empty. The emptiness isn't a warning sign that something has gone wrong with your life. It's the signature of an ending that's already real, arriving before the beginning has had time to form, which means, structurally, that a shift is not something you need to force into existence. It's something already underway, whether or not you can see evidence of it yet. There's a reason this reframe matters practically, not just emotionally. People who believe they're broken tend to respond by trying to fix themselves. More effort, more striving, more forcing a new direction into existence before it's actually ready. People who understand they're in a documented transitional stage tend to respond very differently, with patience toward the process and attention toward what's actually surfacing during it, rather than frantic effort to make it end faster. Only one of those two responses tends to produce a new beginning that actually fits the person who's about to become it. I want to be honest about the limits of this, because a channel that only tells you the flattering version eventually loses your trust, and because this particular topic deserves extra care. What's being described here is a specific, transitional emptiness tied to an identity that's genuinely ending, not clinical depression, which is a different, medically real condition with its own causes and its own need for professional treatment, and which deserves to be taken seriously rather than reframed away as a growth phase. If the emptiness you're feeling comes with persistent hopelessness, loss of interest in nearly everything, disrupted sleep or appetite, or thoughts of harming yourself, that's not the neutral zone this video is describing. That's a signal worth bringing to a doctor or therapist, not something to simply wait out. The pattern in this video is real and it's well documented, but it was never meant to replace professional care when professional care is what's actually needed. Knowing the difference matters more than any reframe this video could offer you. That distinction doesn't shrink the argument. It's what makes the rest of it trustworthy enough to actually use. If what you're feeling matches the pattern this video describes, a documented transitional emptiness tied to an identity that's genuinely ending without the deeper warning signs named above, then everything in this video applies directly to you, starting today. I want to talk to you directly for a moment, because statistically, if you've watched this far, some part of your life has felt hollow lately in a way you haven't been able to explain. You've probably been asking yourself, what's wrong? I'd like to offer a different question instead. What has already ended that you haven't let yourself name yet? Not what's wrong with you. What's finished? Those are two very different questions, and only one of them actually has an answer waiting underneath it. Sit with that difference for a second, because it changes the entire tone of how you carry this stage. What's wrong with me is a question aimed at a flaw, and flaws demand fixing, fast, before anyone notices. What has already ended is a question aimed at a fact, and facts don't need fixing. They need acknowledging and then eventually building around. I still remember, more clearly than almost anything else from that stretch of blankness I described earlier, the exact week it started to lift. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because I finally let myself say out loud to one other person, I think I'm not the person I was a year ago, and I don't fully know who I am now. Saying it didn't fix anything immediately, but it turned a shapeless feeling into a nameable transition. And nameable transitions, unlike shapeless dread, have an actual shape you can move through. I wish someone had told me back then roughly how long these things tend to take, just so I could have stopped checking my own progress against a timeline I'd invented out of impatience. Nobody did, so I'll say it to you instead. This stage rarely resolves in days. It's often weeks, sometimes months. That's not a discouraging fact. It's permission to stop treating week 3 as evidence that something's gone wrong, when week 3 of a documented, months-long process was never going to look finished. If you're in this right now, you don't need to rush toward an answer. You genuinely don't. What you need is permission to stop treating the emptiness as evidence that something's broken and start treating it as evidence that something real has already ended, which means something else is already, quietly, on its way. You also don't need to go through it entirely alone, even if the culture around you doesn't have a ritual for this, the way older ones did. Tell one person what you told me a version of just now, in whatever words actually fit. Not to fix it, just so someone else knows the shape of what you're inside of, the way an elder once would have. That's the whole ask, honestly. Not a 5-step plan, not a deadline for when the emptiness should lift. Just one honest sentence said out loud, to one person who can hold it with you while it finishes doing whatever it's doing. You already know, somewhere underneath the discomfort, that you're not actually lost. You're between 2 versions of a story that's still yours. That's a very different thing than broken, even on the days it doesn't feel like it. Let's return to where we started. Nothing was technically wrong. The job was fine. The relationship was fine. No crisis arrived to explain the hollow feeling that showed up anyway. We asked at the beginning why an emptiness with no clear cause would show up right before a real shift instead of after one. Now you know why. The old identity had already ended structurally, even before you consciously registered it. The new one hadn't formed yet. What you were feeling wasn't a malfunction. It was the exact, well-documented middle stage every culture that has ever formally marked a life transition has recognized for over a century. The liminal stage, the neutral zone, the threshold with no name yet, because you hadn't crossed it yet. Every part of this video pointed at the same underlying fact. This stage was never a break in your story. It was a chapter, the quietest one, doing work no other chapter could do, while the old one was still technically standing. Here's the layer this video hasn't said yet, the one that changes how you'll relate to every future version of this feeling. Emptiness, in this specific context, was never the opposite of progress. It was progress, wearing a shape nobody warned you to expect. Stillness instead of momentum, absence instead of achievement, because the actual work happening in that stage was subtraction, not addition. And subtraction doesn't announce itself the way building something new does. That reframe doesn't make the waiting comfortable. It makes the waiting bearable, which is a different and more honest promise. You don't have to enjoy the neutral zone to trust that it's doing something. You just have to stop treating its silence as proof that nothing is. The version of you on the other side of this stage isn't going to arrive because you forced a decision before it was ready. It's going to arrive the same way it always has, in every culture that ever documented this, quietly once the old scaffolding has finally, completely, come down. You don't have to know what that version looks like yet. Nobody does, from inside the neutral zone. That's not a gap in the process, that's the process doing exactly what it's supposed to do. Once you see that clearly, you can't unsee it. The next time your life goes quiet for no visible reason, you'll be able to ask the sharper question, what has already ended here? And what does that mean is already, quietly, on its way? That single distinction is worth more than any amount of panicking your way toward an answer ever was. Not because the waiting gets easy, because you'll finally know what the waiting is actually for. If there's an emptiness this video pulled into focus, put it in the comments in 5 words or less. Something in me has ended. Naming the ending honestly is the first real step through it. And if this way of seeing things shifted something in you, subscribing here isn't about the algorithm. It's a small contract with the version of you that's learning to sit inside the empty stage instead of panicking through it. Every week, one more piece of the mechanism. If today's idea that this emptiness is a documented stage, not a warning sign, is one you want to sit with more deeply, There's a companion piece that walks through exactly how to move through the neutral zone instead of rushing it. It's a short ebook, quietly pinned in the comments below this video, worth a slow read if this is a stage you recognize in your own life right now. This is the last video in this particular run, but not the last thing I have to say on any of it. Attention, indifference, the parts of yourself you've been fighting, the stillness underneath all of it. If any of it landed this week, the earlier videos are still there, and they were all in one way or another, describing pieces of the same underlying shift. Looking back across the whole week, there's one thread underneath every single video. The thing that looked like the problem, the fight, the grip, the desperation, the emptiness, was never actually the problem. It was the place where the real work was already quietly happening, waiting for you to stop resisting it long enough to notice. You don't need to fill the emptiness. You need to let it finish.